Okay, so today we are going to do the American Revolution. That's right, this is a survey class, and so we do the American Revolution in a single day. It's amazing, right? But that's what you have in a survey class. So let's start talking about the American Revolution. We briefly mentioned the formation of the Continental Congress in our last lecture. So on September 5th, 1774, the first Continental Congress assembled in Philadelphia. All right, and we're all familiar with the Continental Congress. There were 55 members representing 12 of the continental colonies, all but Georgia, Quebec, which is Canada, Nova Scotia, also Canada, Floridas, which were still part of Spain. But of the colonies that were there, the Congress gave serious consideration of creating a plan of union to unite the colonies, and that plan failed only by a vote of 6-5. Meanwhile, we all know Paul Revere came riding in from Massachusetts with what they called the Suffolk Resolves, Suffolk, which Congress endorsed. These resolves, or resolutions, if you will, declared that the intolerable acts were null and void, and urged Massachusetts to arm itself for its own defense and call for economic sanctions against British commerce, then again, bringing back non-importation. They also sent the king a petition for relief and a relief of the issues that they were facing, and addresses to the people of Great Britain about what was going on in America. Finally, the Continental Congress adopted the Continental Association of 1774, which recommended that every county, town, and city form committees to enforce a boycott of British goods. These committees would become the organizational and communication network eventually of the revolution, connecting everybody together throughout the colony so they know what's going on. And again, like I said, they brought back non-importation. Well, none of this played well with the king. He wrote to the prime minister that New England colonies are in a state of rebellion, and blows must decide whether they are to be subject to this country or independent. Only a few members of the parliament really were ready to comprehend, much less accept what the colonists' griefs were. But Edmund Burke, who we mentioned in the last lecture in a brilliant speech on conciliation, said, look, let's just accept the American view on taxation as constant with English principles. And this is a quote from Edmund Burke that I've always used in my own political career, when he said the real question was, quote, not whether you have the right to render your people miserable, but whether it's not in your interest to make them happy, unquote. It's a good point. The Continental Congress urged each colony to mobilize its militia units. The militia was almost as a social as military organization, but now they had to start doing drills, learn tactics, marksmanship, and organize in special units like the Minutemen, who were supposed to be ready within a minute to go fight. Everywhere, the crown, the English government, was losing control over local government. Well, the English decided what they needed to do was give the Americans a bloody nose, punch them in the nose. You know, you punch them in the nose once, give them or as one general said, burn down a couple of their towns, and then they'll learn their lessons. So that's going to bring us to Lexington and Concord. In Massachusetts, the military governor, Thomas Gage, received secret orders to suppress the open rebellion in the colony. Gage had determined to capture and arrest the leaders of the Provincial Congress and to seize the military supply depot at Concord, about 20 miles away. When local patriots got wind of this, they warned John Hancock and Samuel Adams, who Gage really wanted to arrest. They wanted to warn them, and they were in Lexington. So this is where you hear about the midnight riot of Paul Revere and others who flee out of Boston to warn that the British are coming to Lexington and then to the supplies of munitions at Concord. Now, I do say Concord because if you go to Concord, as we say it, they always say Concord. So the British start marching out of Boston. It's no big surprise that they're marching. They get to Lexington, a place called Lexington Green, which, by the way, still exists. If you go to Lexington when you're in Boston, it's pretty amazing. There they found Captain John Parker and about 70 of his Minutemen lined up on the green. Parker apparently only intended to have a silent protest. But when you have a bunch of people that are armed, all it takes is one shot to go off. The British rode up to him and yelled, "Disperse, you rebels, you dogs, run." And the Americans, not looking for a fight, began backing away slowly. Well, then a shot was fired. We don't know if somebody's gun accidentally went off. Did somebody trip? And then the British just open fired, as did the Minutemen. Then the British charged with their bayonets, leaving 8 American dead and 10 wounded. One American whose wife and son had been watching this battle from their house, he crawled 100 yards to die on his front doorstep. Interestingly enough, if you go to Lexington Green, that house still stands. And people live in that house. There are several houses that still stand from that day and that people live in. So interesting to see. The British brought their men under control and said, "Look, we're not here to stop at Lexington. We're going on our way to Concord." But by then it was too late. The Americans had already carried off most of their munitions because they were knowing. But the British did destroy what they could. And then they ran into the Americans at Concord's North Bridge, which, by the way, the bridge still, there is a bridge there. It's not the same bridge. They keep rebuilding it. It's in the Concord River. And if you go on certain days, there are reenactors. There's a British soldier on one side and often an American soldier on the other side. And they're dressed in full period costume, and they talk about this battle. Well, the Americans had started bringing a whole lot of the militias that started swarming in the side. And so when the British tried to cross the North Bridge, the Americans opened fire and inflict casualties on the British platoon. The British decide, okay, look, this isn't going well. Let's get back to Boston. And they have to make a run back to Boston, which is about 20 miles. And by then they are being swarmed over by Patriot militia. People are shooting at them from barns, from behind trees. The British are just shocked by this. They said even the women were shooting at them. They finally make it back to Boston after suffering 250 casualties along the way, and the Americans suffered probably 100. One British general reported to London, he said, "Look, whoever thinks these people are just disorganized like a mob will find themselves very much mistaken." So blood has been shed. The Second Continental Congress will convene in Philadelphia on May 10th, 1775. By then, British-held Boston was under siege by this Massachusetts militia. In other words, the militia that had chased the Redcoats back to Boston now surround Boston. On that very day that Congress met, Fort Ticonderoga fell to New York to a force of what they call the Green Mountain Boys under Ethan Allen of Vermont. And the Massachusetts Volunteers under Benedict Arnold of Connecticut. So Benedict Arnold, somewhat of a hero here in capturing Fort Ticonderoga, which they will take the cannon from Fort Ticonderoga and bring them down to Boston. So now the Continental Congress has sort of a makeshift army surrounding Boston. And they go, okay, what do we do? We've almost by accident become a revolutionary government. So they said, okay, look, we got this army down here, so we've got to have somebody lead it. So the Continental Army decides to appoint somebody. Well, John Adams nominates George Washington. Washington's at the convention, or at the Congress, I'm sorry, he's at the Congress. And of course, he's actually advertising for the job. One, he's probably the tallest person in the room. He's wearing his Virginia militia outfit, so he's dressed as a soldier. And Adams also knows that if he can get the southern states on board, then that will strengthen Massachusetts' hand. So he nominates George Washington. Washington accepts on the condition that he doesn't get paid. On the very day that Washington accepts his commission as the leader of the American Army, is the Battle of Bunker Hill in Boston. You can go to Bunker Hill today and Breeds Hill, the two adjoining hills, and there's a Bunker Hill monument. And if you can actually make it up straight up to 235 stairs, good for you. I've done it. And then your legs start to shake at the end, but it's really interesting. The Americans are on the top of the hill, and General Gage orders a frontal assault. And he orders his frontal assault because they're Americans. He doesn't believe in a lot about the Americans. If this had been the French, he might have rethought that, but they're Americans. What does he care? And so their assault is that they're going to march slowly up the hill until they get within firing range. And remember, they fired 3 deep, because if you were a soldier, a good soldier, you could fire 3 times a minute, right? You load up, ready to fire, you fire. Then you load up again, and then you'd load up again. And so you had 3 lines, so these lines could rotate, and you pack them in together. And one of the reasons you pack them in together is that this massive fire had a psychological impact on your opponent. It was also a matter of command and control, because in the din of battle, there's all this shooting and yelling. Having everybody close together so that they could hear the drums or orders made a lot more sense, and was much easier to maneuver that way, maneuver your men. So they march up there. The Americans are behind emplacements. They've dug trenches, they've got logs, and this first group of British soldiers that get up there are just mowed down, and they have to retreat. The British try it again, they're mowed down again, and on the 3rd time, they're able to rout the Colonials, because the Colonials had run out of gunpowder. So the British eventually took the hill, but at the cost of about 1,000 casualties, and the Colonial losses were about 400. What this is going to do is that it's going to tell the British, we better be a little more cautious. As one general said, any more victories like this, it'll ruin us. And second, it's going to tell the Continental Congress that everybody needs to join the militia. What this is going to do, it's going to divide the population between patriot and loyalist camps. Well, there are still those in the Continental Congress that don't want to have war. They go, look, we're not ready for war. We don't have a navy. We've got to find some sort of compromise with the British. And so they send what they call the Olive Branch Petition, written by John Dickinson. Now, you remember Dickinson. He was one of the wrote letters of Pennsylvania farmer. He had said that, you wouldn't stand by while your neighbor's house is burning, but it doesn't mean that he wants to be independent. He agrees that the United States has legitimate issues with the king and the British government, but we're not ready to be independent. So the Olive Branch petition, written by Dickens, says, hey, and it's directly to the king. It says, we're loyal to you. We're very loyal to you. And we are such loyal subjects, but the problem is you're getting bad advice. Your ministers are wrong about this. What you're hearing is so wrong, but we love you, our king. So when the Olive Branch petition reaches London, why should the king read it, right? Because here are the Americans saying, we love you, but they've formed an illegal government, a rebel government. They have captured British forts at Ticonderoga. They have slaughtered his troops at Lexington and Concord and at Bunker Hill. He's sitting there going, wait a minute, that's a strange kind of love. So he declares that the Americans are open and avowed enemies outside of his protection, and that these traitors need to be hanged. He said that it's a proclamation of rebellion. Well, this still leaves the Americans in a tough situation. It's shocking for the Continental Congress. They are shocked by this response. Even John Dickinson, they don't know how to pursue. They don't know where to go from here. And so they're going to get their hint from a pamphlet published by Tom Paine in 1776. Now, Paine had arrived from England 13 months before. He'd come from a humble Quaker background. He was mainly a drifter. He'd failed in marriage. He'd failed in business. He set sail for America at the age of 37 with a letter of introduction from Ben Franklin, and he wanted to set up a school for young ladies. When that didn't work out, he found out that he was pretty good at politics and writing political pamphlets. And so he wrote Common Sense. in common sense, he tells Americans, look, your squabble isn't with Parliament. Let's blame it who it really belongs to, and it's the king. He says the king is a tyrant. He calls him the royal brute. And he says, you know, what you're doing is you're like that person that's got some job they have to do. It's an unpleasant job, and you just keep putting it off, and it keeps weighing on you, knowing that you have to do it sometime, right? I would argue it's like if you've ever been in a relationship and now you're not happy in your relationship and you've got to break up with your boyfriend or your girlfriend, and you keep putting it off. You keep putting it off because it's uncomfortable to have to do. And that's what Tom Paine is saying. He says, we need to break up from Great Britain. We need to be independent. And so within about 3 months, he had sold 150,000 copies of this, which by the numbers in the United States is an enormous amount of numbers. George Washington said that it's changing the minds of Americans. And it does. On June 7th of 1776, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia introduced a resolution of independence, and it passes on July 2nd, which John Adams said would be the date that would be most memorable in America, which is, he was off by a day or two. Now, the Declaration, of course, is written by Thomas Jefferson. It draws heavily from John Locke and the Glorious Revolution. It talks about that all men are created equal. And this is a point that we should stop and make here, that they really didn't believe all men are created equal. They didn't think all white men and black men were created equal, that all men and women were created equal, or all white men were created equal. They didn't believe that. But what's important to note about the Declaration and those words that all men are created equal is those words will be used by groups of people that Jefferson never thought of would use them all throughout American history, right? When we get to the Declaration of Sentiments at the Seneca Falls Conference about women's rights, it's being used there. It's used by abolitionists. The Declaration is used in documents from around the world when people declare their independence. It's sort of a template. And it rejects this idea of divine right. Jefferson says, look, it's government by consent. And then it goes on to list the crimes of the king. Some of them are a little bit suspicious, but they list the crimes of the king. So America has now declared itself independent. And what we'll do is we'll take up the second part of the revolution next time when we talk about some of the major battles and the divisions that occur within the United States and the creation of a new government under the Articles of Confederation.